Hello, and welcome to One Amazing Story, where we rest and explore the profound moments that shaped our world and our understanding of who we are. I'm your host, and tonight we're going to journey back to the very beginning, to a garden where everything was perfect, where innocence dwelled beneath ancient trees, and where a choice was made that would echo through every generation that followed. This is the story of temptation and fall, of how humanity's first steps into moral awareness came at a tremendous cost, and of how a serpent's whisper changed the course of existence itself. Before we begin, take a moment to settle in. Let your breathing slow and deepen. Release any tension you're holding in your shoulders, your jaw, your hands. We're about to step into a world that existed before pain, before death, before the complicated struggles that define our daily lives. A world of pristine beauty and perfect communion. The story begins not in the garden, but somewhere beyond the boundaries of human experience, in the celestial realm where angelic beings dwelled in the presence of their Creator. Among these beings was one of extraordinary beauty and power, an angel so magnificent that he had been given a place of honor. His name was Lucifer, which means light bearer or morning star. He was created perfect in wisdom and beauty, adorned with precious stones, and given a position of trust and authority. But perfection, without the choice to remain perfect, is merely programming. And Lucifer, gifted with free will, began to nurture thoughts that would ultimately become his undoing. He gazed upon his own splendor and wondered why he should serve when he could rule. He looked at the throne of God and coveted it. 5 times, according to ancient texts, the phrase, "I will," echoed through his rebellious heart. "I will ascend to heaven. I will raise my throne above the stars of God. I will sit on the Mount of Assembly. I will ascend above the heights of the clouds. I will make myself like the Most High." Pride, that most insidious of sins, had taken root in a perfect being. And with that pride came the first rebellion, the first fracture in the harmony of creation. Lucifer persuaded 1/3 of the angelic host to join his coup, and war erupted in heaven itself. But no rebellion against the author of all existence can succeed. Satan, as he would now be known, was cast down from heaven like lightning falling from the sky, taking his followers with him into exile. This fallen angel, seething with rage and envy, turned his attention to a new creation, a place where God had fashioned a paradise for his most beloved creatures, beings made in the very image of their Creator. The Garden of Eden was more than just a place. It was the very intersection of heaven and earth, a sanctuary where the divine presence walked freely, where every tree bore fruit pleasing to the eye and good for food, where rivers flowed with water that sustained all life. The air itself seemed to hum with contentment. No disease marred the perfection of this place. No death cast its shadow across the landscape. No anxiety troubled the hearts of those who lived there. In the center of this garden stood 2 particular trees, each with its own unique purpose and profound significance. The tree of life offered immortality to those who ate its fruit, sustaining them in eternal fellowship with their Creator. The tree of the knowledge of good and evil stood as a test, a single boundary in a paradise of boundless freedom. God had placed the first humans, Adam and Eve, in this garden with a commission to tend it and care for it. They were to be fruitful and multiply, to fill the earth and exercise benevolent stewardship over all living creatures. They were given one prohibition, clear and unambiguous. They could eat from every tree in the garden except one. The tree of the knowledge of good and evil was forbidden, and the consequence for disobedience was equally clear. In the day you eat of it, God had warned, you shall surely die. This was not arbitrary restriction imposed by a jealous deity. This was a test of love, of trust, of obedience freely chosen. For what is love without the freedom to choose otherwise? What is obedience without the possibility of rebellion? What is goodness without the existence of an alternative? Adam and Eve had been warned about the danger that lurked beyond the boundaries of their innocence. Heavenly messengers had come to them, unfolding the history of Satan's fall and his plots for their destruction. They were told that this enemy would seek to ensnare them, to turn their love for God into suspicion, their songs of praise into accusations. They were cautioned never to separate while working in the garden, for together they would be stronger against temptation. But on one fateful day, Eve found herself alone, absorbed in her work among the flowers and fruit-laden branches. She wandered from Adam's side without thinking, without remembering the warnings. And it was then, in that moment of vulnerability, that she heard a voice. The serpent that approached her was no ordinary creature. Before the fall, serpents were among the most beautiful and wise of all animals, with wings that caught the light like burnished gold as they flew through the garden air. This particular serpent, resting in the forbidden tree itself, eating its fruit with apparent immunity, was a sight that arrested Eve's attention. What Eve didn't know was that Satan himself had entered this creature, using it as his instrument of deception. The fallen angel had learned from his own rebellion that a frontal assault would never work. He needed subtlety, cunning, a slow erosion of trust rather than a sudden demand for betrayal. The serpent's first words were crafted with diabolical precision. Did God actually say, "You shall not eat of any tree in the garden"? Notice the strategy at work here. Satan didn't begin by denying God's word. He simply questioned whether God had really said what Eve thought he had said. He introduced doubt not through contradiction, but through distortion, taking what was actually a generous provision, all trees but one, and twisting it to sound like harsh restriction. Eve, perhaps flattered that this magnificent creature would engage her in conversation, perhaps curious about this philosophical discussion, responded with what she remembered of God's command. We may eat of the fruit of the trees in the garden, but God said, "You shall not eat of the fruit of the tree which is in the midst of the garden, neither shall you touch it, lest you die." Her answer was mostly correct, but she had added something God never said. God had prohibited eating, not touching. This small addition, perhaps made by Adam in an abundance of caution, or perhaps a creation of Eve's own fearful imagination, would become Satan's opening, having gotten Eve to misrepresent God's word. Even slightly, the serpent could now attack it directly. "You will not surely die," the serpent said, his musical voice dripping with false reassurance. "For God knows that when you eat of it, your eyes will be opened, and you will be like God, knowing good and evil." With those words, Satan accomplished multiple objectives. He flat out contradicted God's clear warning. He impugned God's motives, suggesting that the prohibition was rooted not in love, but in jealousy. that God was withholding something good to maintain his own superiority. He appealed to pride, offering Eve the same temptation that had been his own undoing, the desire to be like God. The serpent claimed that he himself had eaten of the forbidden fruit and gained the power of speech as a result. Look at what it had done for him, he seemed to say. Imagine what it could do for you. Eve stood there, the forbidden fruit hanging before her eyes, the serpent's words echoing in her mind. For the first time she looked at what God had forbidden and saw it not as a loving boundary, but as an unfair restriction. The fruit was beautiful, pleasing to the eye. It appeared to be good for food, and most enticing of all, it promised wisdom, the ability to discern good and evil for herself without having to trust God's assessment. This is the essence of temptation, the lust of the flesh, what appears good for food and pleasure, the lust of the eyes, what delights and captivates our attention, the pride of life, the desire to elevate ourselves to a position of independence and authority. Eve reached out her hand, she plucked the fruit, she bit into its flesh, and in that moment, the boundary was crossed. The floodgates of consequence began to open, though she didn't yet realize what she had done. She found Adam, who, according to ancient Jewish interpretation, had been with her the entire time, standing silently by as his wife was tempted, abdicating his responsibility to guard and protect. Eve offered him the fruit, and Adam, fully aware of what he was doing, fully cognizant of God's command, chose to join her in rebellion. The moment Adam ate, something fundamental shifted in creation itself. Their eyes were opened, but not in the way the serpent had promised. They suddenly understood good and evil, not from the position of masters who could resist temptation, but from the position of slaves who had succumbed to it. They looked at each other and saw their nakedness for the first time, and with that sight came shame. They had always been naked, of course, but before, their nakedness had been innocent, as natural and unremarkable as the flowers in the garden. Now, knowing they had violated God's trust, they saw their vulnerability and sought to cover it. They sewed fig leaves together, those broad, scratchy leaves that would offer scant comfort, and hid themselves among the trees. When the cool of the evening came, and they heard the sound of God walking in the garden, seeking their fellowship as he always did, they did what rebels have done ever since. They tried to hide from the very presence they had once treasured above all else. "Where are you?" God called out, not because he didn't know, but because he wanted them to recognize what they had done, where they now stood. Adam's voice came from the shadows, strained and fearful. "I heard the sound of you in the garden, and I was afraid, because I was naked, and I hid myself." "Who told you that you were naked?" God asked. "Have you eaten of the tree of which I commanded you not to eat?" What followed was the first instance of what would become a long human tradition: blame-shifting and excuse-making. Adam pointed at Eve, and in his words he even implicitly blamed God himself. "The woman whom you gave to be with me, she gave me fruit of the tree, and I ate," as if to say none of this would have happened if you hadn't created her. Eve, when questioned, pointed at the serpent. "The serpent deceived me, and I ate." But there was no one left for the serpent to blame, and so God pronounced his judgments, beginning with the creature that had been Satan's instrument. The serpent was cursed above all animals, condemned to crawl on its belly and eat dust all the days of its life. But more than that, God pronounced a deeper curse, one aimed not at the animal, but at the fallen angel behind it. I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your offspring and her offspring. He shall bruise your head, and you shall bruise his heel. This cryptic prophecy, known as the Protevangelium or First Gospel, pointed forward to a distant future when another descendant of Eve would come, one who would crush the serpent's head even as the serpent struck at his heel. It was the first glimmer of redemption, the first hint that God's plan included rescue as well as judgment. To Eve, God said that she would bear children in pain, and that her relationship with her husband would be marked by conflict, that he would rule over her in ways that perverted the beautiful partnership they had once known. To Adam, God pronounced a curse upon the ground itself. Cursed is the ground because of you. In pain you shall eat of it all the days of your life. Thorns and thistles it shall bring forth for you, and you shall eat the plants of the field. By the sweat of your face you shall eat bread, till you return to the ground, for out of it you were taken. For you are dust, and to dust you shall return. Work, which had once been joyful stewardship, would now be toilsome labor. The earth itself would resist human efforts, producing thorns alongside crops, and hanging over everything was the shadow of mortality. Death had entered the world, not immediately in the sense of instant annihilation, but as an irreversible process now set in motion. But even in judgment, God showed mercy. He rejected the inadequate fig leaf coverings Adam and Eve had fashioned and instead made garments for them from animal skins. This meant that blood was shed, that an innocent creature died to cover human shame. It was a foreshadowing of the greater sacrifice that would one day be required to truly deal with sin. Then came the expulsion. Adam and Eve could not remain in the Garden of Eden, not because God wanted to punish them further, but because of what they might do next. Behold, God said, the man has become like one of us in knowing good and evil. Now, lest he reach out his hand and take also of the tree of life and eat and live forever. To live forever in a fallen state, to be immortal while bearing the weight of sin and shame, separated from intimate fellowship with God, would be hell itself. And so, in mercy disguised as judgment, God drove them from the garden. He stationed cherubim at the eastern entrance, mighty angelic beings wielding flaming swords that turned in every direction, guarding the way to the tree of life. Adam and Eve stepped out of paradise into a world that would now produce thorns and thistles, a world where childbirth would bring pain, where work would bring sweat, where relationships would be marked by conflict, and where, at the end of all things, death would come for everyone. The first couple stood outside the garden, looking back at what they had lost. Behind them, the flaming swords turned and flashed in the light. Before them stretched an unknown world, no longer a carefully tended garden, but wild land that would resist their efforts. Eve clutched at her garment of animal skin, perhaps the first time she had truly understood that death was now a reality, that an innocent creature had paid the price for their covering. The tragedy of the fall extends far beyond Adam and Eve themselves. The doctrine that emerged from this event, known as original sin, teaches that their guilt and corrupted nature passed to all their descendants. Every human born since that day has inherited a tendency towards sin, a nature that finds it easier to doubt God than to trust Him, easier to pursue selfish desires others than to seek righteousness. The Apostle Paul would later write that just as sin entered the world through one man, Adam, and death through sin, so death spread to all people because all sinned. The entire creation, he said, was subjected to futility, groaning together in the pains of childbirth, waiting for redemption. But here's what we must understand about the fall. It was not the end of the story. The very curse pronounced on the serpent contained a promise. The crushing of Satan's head pointed forward to a second Adam who would succeed where the first Adam failed. Where Adam hid from God in shame, the second Adam would face God in perfect obedience. Where Adam blamed others for his sin, the second Adam would take the blame for others' sins upon himself. Where Adam's disobedience brought death to all, the second Adam's obedience would bring life to all who believe. The tree of knowledge, which had been the instrument of humanity's fall, would find its counterpart in another tree, a cross on a hill called Calvary, where the promised seed of the woman would be lifted up, where his heel would be bruised by Satan's final assault, and where, in dying, he would crush the serpent's head forever. The Garden of Eden remained on earth for many generations after Adam and Eve's expulsion. Their descendants could see it from a distance, could gaze upon the cherubim and the flaming sword, a constant reminder of what had been lost and what might one day be restored. They came to its gates to worship, to renew their vows of obedience, to remember, but they could not enter. Eventually, when human wickedness had grown so great that God determined to cleanse the earth with a flood, the garden itself was removed from this world. But the promise remained that in the final restoration, when there would be a new heaven and a new earth, it would be restored, more glorious than at the beginning, and in that restoration, the tree of life would stand once again, accessible to all who had been redeemed. Those who had kept God's commandments would breathe in immortal vigor beneath its branches. Through unending ages, the inhabitants of sinless worlds would behold in that garden a demonstration of what the whole earth would have become had humanity fulfilled the Creator's original design. The story of the temptation and fall asks us to confront difficult questions. Why would a good God allow temptation in the first place? Why place the forbidden tree where it could be reached? Why permit Satan access to the garden? The answers lie in understanding the nature of love and freedom. God could have created automatons, beings programmed to obey without choice, but such obedience would be meaningless, no more valuable than a recording of someone saying, "I love you." True love requires the freedom to choose otherwise. True obedience requires the possibility of disobedience. The prohibition on the tree was not some arbitrary test, not God being difficult or controlling. It was the necessary boundary that made freedom real and love meaningful. Without it, Adam and Eve would have been cosmic pets, not partners in relationship with their Creator. And yet, the lightness of the test makes the sin all the more grievous. God did not ask for heroic sacrifice or tremendous effort. He simply asked them to refrain from one thing while enjoying everything else. If they could not pass this smallest of tests, how could they be trusted with greater responsibilities? Some have questioned whether the punishment was disproportionate to the crime. Eating a piece of fruit seems like such a small thing compared to the tide of woe that followed. But this perspective misunderstands the nature of what occurred in Eden. The issue was not the physical act of eating, but the spiritual act of rebellion. Adam and Eve didn't just break a rule, they broke faith. They chose to doubt God's goodness, to question His motives, to place their judgment above His wisdom. In doing so, they revealed that their hearts were not fully devoted to their Creator, and a heart divided cannot stand in the presence of a holy God. The consequences that followed, the pain and death and separation, were not vindictive punishments so much as the natural result of severing the relationship that sustained all life. The fall teaches us about the nature of temptation itself, patterns that continue to this day. Satan still questions God's word, asking, "Did God really say?" He still denies consequences, insisting, "You will not surely die." He still appeals to pride, promising, "You will be like God." And we, like Eve, still focus on what God has prohibited rather than on all He has provided. We still add to God's commands, making them seem more burdensome than they are. We still listen to voices that tell us God is holding out on us, that we deserve more, that we should be autonomous judges of good and evil rather than trusting our Creator's wisdom. Consider the deeper implications of what transpired in Eden when Adam and Eve chose to eat the forbidden fruit. They were not merely breaking a dietary restriction, they were fundamentally rejecting their identity as created beings. They were saying, in effect, that they could determine truth and morality for themselves, that they didn't need God's guidance, that His boundaries were obstacles to overcome rather than safeguards to embrace. This desire for autonomy, for self-determination apart from God, lies at the root of every sin that has followed. When we lie, we're declaring that we know better than God about what truth should be in that moment. When we steal, we're asserting our right to redefine ownership according to our desires. When we harbor hatred or lust or pride, we're claiming the authority to set our own standards of righteousness. The knowledge of good and evil that Adam and Eve gained was not the elevated wisdom Satan promised. It was the bitter experiential knowledge that comes from being on the wrong side of God's law. Before the fall, they knew good by intimate fellowship with God. Evil existed only as an external threat, something that could be recognized and resisted. After the fall, evil became part of their internal reality, a constant struggle within their own hearts. This fractured state affected every aspect of human existence. Adam and Eve's relationship, which had been perfectly harmonious, became marked by conflict and domination. Their work, which had been joyful cultivation, became exhausting toil against a resistant environment. Their relationship with the natural world, over which they had been given benevolent authority, became adversarial. Even their own bodies, which had been sustained by the tree of life, began the slow process of decay that would end in death. And yet, in the midst of all this judgment and consequence, we see something remarkable. God came looking for them. He called out, "Where are you?" Not because He had lost track of them, but because He wanted them to recognize their condition and return to Him. He asked questions not to gain information, but to give them opportunity to confess, to acknowledge what they had done. When Adam and Eve tried to cover themselves with fig leaves, those broad, inadequate coverings that would have been uncomfortable and ultimately useless, God provided something better. He made garments of skin, which required the death of an animal. Blood was shed for the first time in creation's history. An innocent creature died so that guilty humans could be covered. This act of divine mercy pointed forward to the ultimate covering for sin, when the Lamb of God would shed his blood to provide garments of righteousness for all who believe. The pattern was established in Eden. Human effort to cover sin is insufficient. Only a substitute, only innocent blood can truly atone. The expulsion from Eden, painful though it was, also demonstrated God's protective love. Imagine living forever in a state of guilt and shame, forever separated from intimate fellowship with God, forever bearing the weight of that first rebellion. Imagine watching as sin multiplied and intensified through generations upon generations, but never finding release through death. By barring access to the tree of life, God ensured that this fallen existence would be temporary. Death, which had entered as an enemy, would also serve as a door through which humanity could eventually pass into something new. The grave that seemed like the ultimate defeat would become, for those who trusted in God's promise of redemption, merely a passageway to resurrection and restoration. The cherubim stationed at Eden's eastern gate were not merely guards preventing return. They were also a reminder, a signpost pointing humanity forward to a day when the way would be opened again, when paradise would be restored, when fellowship with God would be re-established on an even firmer foundation than before. The story of the fall is ultimately about the cost of disobedience and the necessity of redemption. It shows us that we cannot save ourselves, that once we have eaten the forbidden fruit, we cannot uneat it. We need rescue from outside ourselves. But it also shows us a God who, even in pronouncing judgment, is already planning salvation. A God who covers inadequate fig leaves with garments of skin, who promises a seed that will crush the serpent, who drives his children from paradise, not in rage, but in mercy, protecting them from eternal existence in a fallen state. As we close this story tonight, consider the profound truth at its heart. Every one of us stands outside Eden, looking back at what was lost. Every one of us bears the mark of that ancient rebellion. Every one of us faces temptations that echo the serpent's whispers, offering us autonomy, pleasure, and wisdom at the cost of trust in our Creator. But we also stand in the shadow of the cross, that other tree, where the promised seed crushed the serpent's head and opened the way back to paradise. The flaming sword still turns at Eden's gate, but it no longer bars our way. It has been satisfied by the one who walked through its fire on our behalf. The garden awaits restoration. The tree of life will bear fruit again, and those who choose obedience, who resist temptation, who trust God's goodness even when voices whisper doubt, will one day stand beneath its branches, breathing immortal air, dwelling in the presence of their Creator as Adam and Eve once did. But with something Adam and Eve never had: the knowledge of redemption, the testimony of grace, the wonder of being loved enough to be rescued. If you enjoyed this exploration of one of humanity's most profound stories, please consider liking this video and subscribing to One Amazing Story. We have many more journeys through history, faith, and the human experience waiting for you. Until next time, may you find rest in the truth that even our falls can be redeemed, and that paradise lost is not paradise lost forever.